Good day. Today is Friday, 27th March 2026. And before I proceed with this program, let me remind you again to tick the like button and check your subscription to this channel. If once you've watched this program, you decide that you like what you've heard and wish to indicate that fact. Now today, Friday, 27th March 2026, we are a month into the conflict between the United States and Iran. I should say the United States, Israel and Iran. It began on the 28th of February. We're now almost at the 28th of March. There was expectations on the part of many people that once the attack took place, Iran would collapse like a house of cards. The President of the United States and his officials and the Prime Minister of Israel and his officials were excited and euphoric when on the first day, 28th of February 2026, the Supreme Leader of Iran, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, and many of his top officials were killed in Israeli missile strikes on his residence. But all those expectations of collapse, demoralization, chaos, power struggles, talk of coups, talk of uprisings by protesters in the aftermath of that strike, well, all of those things all those expectations proved completely misplaced. On the contrary, Iran immediately struck back, inundating the Middle East with volleys of thousands of missiles and drones, attacking targets in Israel, attacking US bases across the Middle East, targeting radar stations, and as many had warned, the Iranian government rapidly reconstituted itself, managed to appointed another supreme leader, Moshtaba Khamenei, who has taken over the role of supreme leader from his father. And anyway, the war continues. And of course, the Iranians shortly after closed the Strait of Hormuz, precipitating the enormous and growing energy crisis that we see. Now, many people are still in denial about all of this. They continue to maintain, as does the President of the United States from time to time, that all is going well, that all is going entirely according to plan, that the United States, as the President says, is ahead of its timetable. He's spoken about how that timetable might be, 4 weeks, but then we are at the end of those 4 weeks, or 6 weeks, or less than 6 weeks. Of course, as was pointed out to me by Daniel Davis, if the United States is ahead of its timetable, and the timetable for the war actually was 6 weeks, well, we've presumably either reached that point or are close to reaching that point, and victory and the end of the war should be around the corner. But there is, of course, absolutely no sign that this is so. Yesterday, the President of the United States again spoke about how he'd been gifted by the Iranians some mysterious gift that turned out to be the transit of 10 tankers through the Strait of Hormuz. But of course, this was something that the Iranians arranged themselves, that they received payment for. Those tankers are ferrying oil to countries like China and India after deals done between Iran and those countries. Iran continues to export oil. In fact, its oil exports have actually grown as it is taking up the slack of some of the Arab oil producers, which aren't able to increase their production of oil. It seems to me that if the Iranians have given anybody a present in this matter of the tankers, that is a present which they have given to themselves. Anyway, the president said that, and he says all sorts of other things. He said at various times that 90% of Iran's missile capabilities have been destroyed. Then he said a few days later that 82% of Iran's missile capabilities have been destroyed. Well, I read just a few minutes ago in Reuters, the British news agency, exclusive, US can only confirm about a third of Iran's missile arsenal destroyed, sources say. And then it continues, the United States can only determine with certainty that it has destroyed about a third of Iran's vast missile arsenal. The status of around another third is less clear, which to my mind suggests that it is mostly still there. And we then go on to read that the sources said the intelligence was similar for Iran's drone capability. There was some degree of certainty that about a third had been destroyed. I am sure that is wrong, and later in this program I will explain why. But anyway, in the meantime, as the same article from Reuters acknowledges, the Iranians managed to continue military operations. They continue to conduct their missile strikes. In fact, if you go to the Iranian media, they now talk about over 80 missile volleys having been launched by Iran since the start of the war. And going back to that article in Reuters, it says that despite the heavy pace of US strikes, Iran has demonstrated that it has not run out of weapons. On Thursday alone, in other words, yesterday, it fired 15 ballistic missiles at the United Arab Emirates, along with 11 drones, according to the UAE's defense ministry. And the article continues, quoting a US expert. The fact that they managed to sustain this indicates the US was overstating the success of its operation, which is obviously and manifestly true. So the Iranians continue to launch missiles. They continue to launch drones. Now, about a week ago, I received an email from someone, and I'm not going to disclose who that was, which provided information about the desperate straits of US military personnel in one of the US bases in the Middle East. And this included comments by some of the people there about the fact that the people in Washington didn't seem to understand how bad the situation was. I'm not going to say more. But anyway, what we now learn, and it's been confirmed in an article in the New York Times, is that the United States has had to evacuate US military personnel from these bases. So that there has in effect been a retreat by the US military from many of its bases, maybe most of its bases, for all I know, most of its bases, at least in the Persian Gulf area. And this, of course, comes on top of reports that the United States is having to withdraw its forces from Iraq. And by the way, Turkey, another country that has kept forces inside Iraq, has now confirmed that it is also withdrawing its forces from Iraq also. And, well, we've had other reports as well. An article, I think it was also in the New York Times a few days ago, confirmed that 10 radar stations that the United States has in the Middle East, that those have also all been destroyed, causing billions of dollars of damage which might take years to repair. And there's even been claims that the situation with the two aircraft carriers in the region, the Gerald Ford and the Abraham Lincoln, is, shall we say, suboptimal. The Gerald Ford positioned itself from a time in the Red Sea. It has had unending problems with broken toilets, with fires in the laundry system. It's had to return to Crete for repairs. There's talk of disaffection amongst the crew who have been at sea for 10 months. There was even an article in the Daily Telegraph which mentioned or touched on the rumours of sabotage. That is not to say, by the way, that there was sabotage on the part of the crew. I don't know. It's interesting, however, that the Daily Telegraph, of all newspapers, at least mentioned that possibility. And anyway, the word now is that the Ford is going to have to return to the United States and is going to have to be laid out for repair for at least 14 months before it is able to go back to sea again. Well, that's already, I suppose, a blow, but at least it is not the result of Iranian military action. But there are now more reports that Iranian drones have managed to reach the Abraham Lincoln in the Arabian Sea, and that there have been drone impacts. And whilst these presumably only do superficial damage to a ship as large and as heavy as a tanker, well, the fact that these attacks supposedly have taken place, I am unable to confirm them. The Iranians allege them all the time, but I've seen reports about these attacks in the media in Britain, and one can tell that the writers of these reports believe, despite denials, that there might be some truth to these reports after all. But anyway, whatever, the fact remains that the Lincoln also appears to be keeping carefully out of missile range. So the president may say that everything is going entirely according to plan, that things are going ahead of schedule. But the facts tell us a different story. And of course, the most important, the most pressing fact is that the Strait of Hormuz continues to remain closed. Energy prices continue to rise. There are increasing reports that the Iranian leadership that has been reconstituted following the assassination of the earlier Iranian officials, that this new leadership is younger, more militant, more hardline than the one that it is succeeding, and is more firmly anchored in the IRGC than the previous Iranian government. I ought to say that I personally would regard all speculations about the political balance between the various institutions within Iran with intense skepticism. If you want to read an interesting discussion of the Iranian political structures, I would again suggest going to the latest article by Cortelia the Contemplator in his outstanding Substack site. He is a diplomat, I believe, a former diplomat, as he has confirmed. I believe that he has had previous contacts with Iran. He seems to have a certain understanding of the political system there. And I would suggest that anybody who wants to understand it, read that article. Certainly, I don't believe that a system such as the one which exists in Iran is going to fall under the control of any one single institution like the IRGC. But what I will say is, I do think it is likely that the new political order in Iran is more hardline, tougher minded than the one which preceded it. And, well, we continue to have all the rumours, all the speculations about military operations, ground operations by the United States in this region. The seizure of islands, the seizure of Hark Island. I read a report that in Israel, the Israelis have been told by a diplomat from one of the mediating countries, I wonder which one, that President Trump has made a decision to try to capture Hark Island. Well, that may be true, or it may not be true, but I've already expressed my own opinion about the capture of Hark Island. I worry, I believe that it might end up being a trap. I've discussed what happened to the French in Dien Bien Phu, how they found themselves in effect surrounded or trapped when they tried to insert themselves in exactly that way. It seems to me that Hark Island is well within reach of the Iranian coastline. The Iranians can shell it with shore-based artillery, concealed in the mountains. They can also shell any occupying US force with missiles. They can mine the seas around Hark Island, which would make relief of the force there by sea and its resupply extremely dangerous and very difficult, bearing in mind claims from a former officer of the British Royal Navy that neither the American fleet nor the British fleet are really trained any longer to deal with mines, sea mines. And there is a further factor as well, because Hark Island would be well within reach of fibre optic drones operating from the Iranian coast. Now, yesterday I received a lengthy email from a source who has access to information inside Russia. That's how I'm going to describe him. And this source reminded me of something he told me about a week ago, before that story appeared in the Financial Times, about the Russians supplying drones and drone technology to the Iranians. Anyway, this source said that since the June 2025 war, both Russia and Iran have been re-equipping, so both Russia and China have been re-equipping Iran with vast stockpiles of drones. Some of them have been directly sent there by the Russians. Others have been manufactured in various factories, many outside Iran. Some have been manufactured in Iran itself using Chinese components and technology. And, well, this person's assessment, overall assessment, is that the Iranians have something like a million drones available for use. Of course, these cover many different types. They include FPV drones, first-person view drones. They include Shahid type drones. They include any number of drones, mostly concealed in regions in central and eastern Iran, where the American and Israeli forces find it difficult to go, find it difficult to reach. And going back to the Russians, starting from 2024 and increasingly throughout 2025, the Russians developed fibre optic technology to pilot their FPV drones, a technology which the Ukrainians, incidentally, have never mastered to anything like the same degree. The Russians have become masters at operating fibre optic drones. And, well, it seems to me that if you look at the distances, fibre optic drones can certainly operate over Kharg Island from positions in the Iranian coastline, on the Iranian coast. So the American troops on Kharg Island might have to contend with those. Obviously, the United States could try to bomb the drone operators and kill the drone operators. That might be more difficult at night, at least I'm guessing. And bear in mind, fibre optic drones, at least the Russian ones, have night vision technology, which makes them particularly dangerous and makes them particularly potent at night as well. It may be, and then this is I simply don't know, that fibre optic cables are not really adapted to operation over the sea. I don't myself see why, but who knows? Maybe that is the case. If it is so, my guess is that over time, probably already, the cables have been adapted by the Russians, by the Iranians, by the Russians, the Iranians and the Chinese, all of them at once, or some of them, or one of them, to operate overseas. So, yes, the Americans could try to attack the drone operators. But then I come back on the coast, but I come back to that other report in the Financial Times about how the Russians have been sending thousands of man-pads to Iran. The Chinese, of course, could send many, many more. I am guessing that attempts to attack drone operators using helicopter gunships or ground attack aircraft would bring those helicopter gunships and ground attack aircraft well within the range of those man-portable air defense missiles that the Iranians already have, by the way, in significant quantities, and they produce various types themselves, but they're getting, as I said, further ones from the Russians. The Russians, of course, and the Chinese, and to some extent the Iranians too, have the ability to monitor and observe what is going on Kharg Island. Maybe, as I said, it is still an achievable military operation. Perhaps there are things about it that I don't know, but as I've said in many programs, the risk seems to me enormous and out of proportion to any possible gain. And the same is true about possible ground operations on the Iranian coastline and in various islands in the Strait of Hormuz. All of the problems that I discussed in an operation against Kharg Island would apply to ground operations there as well. Now, I should say that I've been watching various programs that the former administration official and former director of the US's counter-terrorism agency, Joe Kent, the official who resigned in protest against the war. Anyway, I've been watching programs that he's made, including an interesting one that he made with Daniel Davis, just saying. Joe Kent felt that sending US troops to any one of the islands, Kharg Island or the islands in the Strait of Hormuz, would be, in effect, giving the Iranians American soldiers as sort of hostages. They would be trapped on these islands. Joe Kent is a former Special Forces soldier. He has a record here, an extensive record here. I assume that he knows what he's talking about. Daniel Davis, who spoke with him, who is a former lieutenant colonel in the US Army, and who, by the way, I count as a personal friend, also said to me on a program that forces like the 82nd Airborne Division and some of the Marine forces that have been deployed to the area, that these are spearhead forces designed to capture bridgeheads. This is what that other source, who is familiar with these things, with the 82nd Airborne Division, who wrote to me a couple of days ago, also told me that the 82nd Airborne, the Marines, are not really tasked, they're not really designed to hold on to positions indefinitely. The tough fighters, tough and aggressive fighters, though they of course are, that in order to hold positions, one would expect to see heavy infantry take their place. And Daniel Davis made the point that so far there is no evidence that any heavy infantry is in fact being deployed to the Persian Gulf region. And my guess is, given the time and logistics that would be needed to achieve that that could be weeks or months in the making, even if the order were to be given now. So, as things stand, and barring something unexpected, or something unexpected by me, because, to repeat again, I'm not a military expert, it seems to me that the president is stuck. He is not able to force open the Strait of Hormuz. He is not able to take action that can change the strategic calculus. Iran has most of its missiles. It probably has huge numbers of drones. Some of these drones are very sophisticated. There are, I know, worries in Israel itself, it's been discussed in the Financial Times, that the Iranians have still not used their most advanced missiles. They still seem to be holding those back. Perhaps they're only available in limited quantities. The United States, in the meantime, is depleting its inventories, and the energy costs and the problems with supply chains are growing. Now, the president yesterday did something else which also points to problems, and that was that he again, exactly as I expected, postponed activation of his ultimatum. The ultimatum he made a week ago, demanding that Iran open the Strait of Hormuz within 48 hours, failing which the United States would destroy its entire energy system, Iran's entire energy system. I pointed out that that was unachievable. I pointed out that the only effect of doing something like that would be to expose the entire region to further Iranian retaliation, with the Iranians attacking energy production facilities across the Middle East, potentially desalination plants, causing far more damage to the global economy than they might themselves receive from American attacks upon their energy system. And I said on Monday that when the president postponed his ultimatum by 5 days on the basis of successful negotiations that had supposedly taken place over the weekend, that was obviously a fiction, that the president, in other words, was lying, that there had been no negotiations at all, that the president was simply spinning a story in order to avoid acting on his ultimatum. And of course, that is exactly what he did. He postponed it for 5 days. Well, those 5 days ended today. All the things that made it impossible for the president to proceed with his ultimatum on Monday still apply. Attacks on the Iranian energy system of the kind that he was talking about would still invite enormous and devastating Iranian retaliation. So he has entirely predictably, again announced that he is postponing implementation of his ultimatum, this time by a further 10 days. And of course, he continues to talk about talks, about negotiations with the Iranians. He says that the Iranians are begging him for a deal, that it is he who is holding back on the deal. The reality, I would suggest, is the diametric opposite. On the contrary, given the situation that he finds himself in, it is the president who needs to get the Strait of Hormuz opened. It is the president who needs to find a way of ending hostilities. And it is the president, therefore, in the absence of good, achievable military options, who is in effect begging the Iranians for talks. And, well, we got further stories about this today, this time from the German foreign minister, Joseph Wadephul, who says that based on my information, there have been indirect contact and preparations have been made to meet directly. That is to say, the Americans and the Iranians, will meet very soon in Pakistan, apparently. That was said by Johann Wadephul. But then, of course, we had the immediate response from Pakistan itself. Ishaq Dar, Pakistan's foreign minister, said his government had been relaying messages between the warring sides with help from Turkey and Egypt, but he could not confirm a formal meeting. And again, I've gone to the Iranian media, and there is no hint of any meeting between Iran and the United States pending there. To repeat again, the story is that the Iranians have made it absolutely clear that if there is going to be a meeting with the Americans and such a meeting could happen in Pakistan. They absolutely will not meet with Witkoff and Kushner, who they believe, I think rightly, to have been negotiating with them in bad faith. They insist that they meet with someone more senior from the US government. The administration does at least appear to understand that. And the word out there is that Donald Trump has now effectively designated his vice president, J.D. Vance, someone who, according to all reports, was deeply skeptical about this operation from the outset, that he is the man who the president now is hoping will be able to find a way of talking to the Iranians, coming to some kind of agreement with the Iranians, an agreement in which the United States unavoidably is going to have to make major concessions, assuming that the Iranians are prepared to negotiate at all. And, well, we'll see what Vance is able to do. Now, it may be difficult to get the Iranians to talk. At the moment, I get the sense that they're not interested in talking in the slightest. They have been engaging in their own information campaign. And they've just published a video in which they speak of themselves as acting to avenge previous acts of aggression by the United States, extending all the way back to Vietnam in the 1960s. This video has been widely viewed. I expect that many of you have already watched it. And it does, to my mind, speak of a very implacable mood amongst the existing hardline leadership of Iran. Well, I've already said that the one thing which could just possibly persuade the Iranians to engage in negotiations is if these negotiations are brokered in some way by Iran's key allies, China and Russia, with the Russians now taking center stage. Because so far as I can tell, in terms of the more, shall we say, immediately relevant intelligence, satellite intelligence about the whereabouts of American warships, for example, assistance in conducting drone warfare, improvements in Iranian missile technology, help with Iran's air defenses, practical help with Iran's air defenses. It is the Russians who seem to be taking the lead. And, well, that may explain increasing worries in London and Europe about the long-term commitment of the United States, not just to the conflict in Ukraine, but to Europe, to the defense of Europe altogether. After all, President Trump has increasingly been saying that the Iran war, the conflict with Iran, was a test for NATO, a test which in his eyes and in the eyes of other US officials, NATO has completely failed. The United States went to war with Iran. Perhaps it's worth pointing out at this point that the fact that the United States was about to attack Iran was obvious to people like me long before the attack took place. I've been talking about it ever since the June 2025 war. And it was becoming increasingly obvious in the weeks leading up to the attack itself. No European leader talked or protested against it. No European leader went to Washington, demanded to see what the president's plans were, and asked him to rethink, or told him that what he was proposing to do was not properly thought out and would inflict huge damage to the global economy and would, for that reason, not be supported by NATO and by Europe. No European leader did that. No European leader has gone to Washington since the start of the war and told the president to his face that the whole operation is mistaken and wrong and must be stopped. None of them have done this. So, given this failure to oppose his policy of war with Iran, it is completely understandable if the president assumed that in attacking Iran, he would have America's European allies fully on board with him, and why he currently feels badly let down by their passivity. And I suspect, by the way, that here the German defense minister's Boris Pistorius' comment that this is not Europe's war will have especially rankled. Anyway, it's completely unsurprising that the president himself feels angry and let down by America's European allies, and why the relationship between Europe and the United States has deteriorated further still. Earlier generations of European leaders like Gerhard Schröder and Jacques Chirac at the time of the Iraq War of 2003, or before that, leaders like Harold Wilson and Margaret Thatcher in Britain, Willy Brandt and Helmut Schmidt in Germany, Charles de Gaulle and to a certain extent François Mitterrand in France, would never have let themselves get into that kind of situation. They would have well understood the catastrophic effect on the European economy and on their own societies as a result of this war. They would have made it clear, made their opposition to the Americans clear, as all of those leaders that I've just mentioned did make it clear in relation to various wars. In Margaret Thatcher's case, Grenada; in Wilson's and de Gaulle's case, Vietnam; in Chirac's and Schröder's case, Iraq; in Schmidt's and Mitterrand's and Brandt's, Willy Brandt's case, or the many other conflicts that the United States also found itself in. But the useless, supine, incompetent leaders of Europe did no such thing. And now, as we will see, they find themselves confronted with the United States and a president who feels betrayed by them, and they're becoming worried. And there's an article about this in the London Times, and it reads as follows: Europe should prepare for scenario where US makes deal with Russia. Senior officials fear Trump will abandon NATO allies as the US president considers diverting key resources from Ukraine to his war in Iran. But then we go very quickly to discover that it isn't just about Ukraine. Fears are mounting in Britain and the rest of Europe that America will abandon its NATO allies, not just Ukraine, its NATO allies, and make a deal with Russia, sources have disclosed to the Times. Senior European officials and a new report from MPs both warned Europe should be in a position to fight alone in a worst-case scenario. A total fantasy, by the way. The idea that the Europeans can take on the Russians by themselves, as I have endlessly pointed out, is pure fantasy. But anyway, the article then continues. Sources express concern that Trump may no longer protect NATO member states if Russia were to attack their territory. And then we hear that a European official said the Americans withdrawing from European security affairs is no longer the worst case scenario. The worst case scenario is America withdrawing from European security and turning against us. That, of course, is paranoid, but then it continues. The Europeans worried this could involve Trump attempting to do a grand bargain with the Russians over our heads, things that seemed impossible 5 to 6 years ago. And then we go on to read a British military source also raised concerns that the United States might not be there to protect the eastern flank of NATO if it were attacked. Now, all of this talk of a grand bargain between the United States and the Russians, I strongly suspect hints at the perennial worries that the United States, in serious trouble in the Middle East, finding it increasingly difficult to get the Iranians to agree to come to the negotiating table, is indeed going to turn to the only party that really is in a position to exercise leverage on Iran, which is Russia, and is going to have to pay the very steep price that the Russians are going to demand for Russia exercising that leverage to get those talks with Iran started. I think these fears, in fact, I'm going to say more than that, I am sure that these fears are now circulating across all European capitals. There is something further which should not be overlooked, and this relates to the perennial topic of US security guarantees. US security guarantees for Ukraine, US security guarantees for the European members of NATO. NATO itself, after all, is a type of US security guarantee to the European states that are members of NATO. It is many other things too. It is, as my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou never ceases to point out, a gigantic grift which makes lots of money for all the people who are involved in it. But at the outset, when it was created back in the 1940s, that was what NATO basically was, and what it has remained basically ever since. As the first ever NATO Secretary General, Lord Ismay, famously said, NATO, the purpose of NATO is to keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. It's ultimately all about keeping the Americans in, because without the Americans, you can't realistically hope to keep the Russians out or even the Germans down. So that's one level of security guarantees. But there's another country that's also been seeking security guarantees from the United States too. And that country is, of course, Ukraine. Vladimir Zelensky has spent the whole of the last year, in fact more than the last year, since basically the special military operation began, agitating and badgering the Americans for American security guarantees for Ukraine. At one point, he was trying to link the mineral rights deal that Trump was insisting on with an offer, or rather an agreement by the United States for security guarantees for Ukraine. He's also at various times, at one point, at the time of his argument, his row in the Oval Office with Trump and Vance, he was also insisting that Ukraine would only agree to a ceasefire on the existing front lines if the United States were to provide Ukraine with a security guarantee. And, well, he's modified his position on both points. He's had to. There's a mineral rights agreement deal, which basically is inactive, not worth the paper it's written on. And Zelensky now himself insists on a ceasefire, and all of this without obtaining security guarantees from the Americans. But nonetheless, and notwithstanding, he continues to talk all the time about the importance after the war, or when the fighting ends, of Ukraine being given by the United States security guarantees. In fact, he claims that there's even a document in existence setting out the security guarantees that the United States would provide to Ukraine in the event of an end to the fighting. And the Russians are very unhappy about the fact that if this document exists, they have never been shown it. Well, he's not the only person who has been demanding security guarantees of a certain type from the Americans. Starmer and Macron have been busy doing the same thing. They've been talking for over a year now about deploying European forces to Ukraine on various ever evolving pretexts and missions. European forces which would either enforce a ceasefire or police a ceasefire or provide Ukraine with some kind of security. There's been the coalition of the willing and all of these things. Well, Macron and Starmer have repeatedly said that this is only possible if the Americans give the Europeans what they call a backstop protection, in other words, for these European forces in Ukraine if these forces are attacked by the Russians, as the Russians have said that they would do. And both Macron and Starmer, but perhaps especially Starmer, have said that the entire idea of deploying European forces to Ukraine hinges upon the United States providing that backstop, which is, of course, another type of security guarantee. And back in the summer, to the evident excitement of the Europeans, they came away, Macron and Starmer, believing after the Alaska summit that they'd finally managed to extract from Trump a commitment to provide that backstop if at some point in the indeterminate future, those European troops were indeed deployed to Ukraine. But of course, all of these security guarantees only have value if the United States is committed to act on them, and if those who receive these security guarantees, the NATO states, the Ukrainians, the British and the French, believe that the Americans will act on them, and if the Russians also believe that the Americans will act on them. Well, what we've seen in the Iranian conflict up to now is that security guarantees provided by the United States not only do not protect you, but can actually expose you to massive damage and attack. Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf cooperation countries all believed that they had security guarantees from the United States. They all relied on the US for protection. That is why they granted to the United States use of their territory for the United States to establish bases. And the United States did establish those bases across the territory of the Gulf Cooperation Council, and did repeatedly make promises and give assurances that it would be able to protect these countries. And what has happened? Well, since the 28th of February, we have seen that with all its power, with all the force that it has at its disposal, the United States has been so far unable to provide the Gulf Cooperation Council, the countries that make it up, with the protection that they assumed they had from the security guarantees that the Americans gave them. This has come as a global shock. It is something that perhaps is underestimated in discussions of this war. If the United States cannot protect the Gulf Cooperation Council states from Iran, which is a middle-rank power with significant armed forces, significant missile capabilities, significant drone capabilities, but obviously is not a great power and is obviously not a nuclear power. If the United States cannot defend these Arab states from Iran, how is it going to protect the Ukrainians, the European forces in Ukraine, the NATO states, in the event that there is any kind of conflict, direct conflict with the Russians, who are many times more powerful? Well, again, this isn't something you're going to find extensively discussed in the media, but of course the fear, the worry, the thoughts about it are circulating all over Europe. They are being undoubtedly, in fact I know they are, being talked about in quiet corners, in corridors, in foreign ministries, in chancelleries, right across Europe. Is the United States less powerful than we all believed? Is the United States less able to protect us than we believed? Is it less willing to protect us than we all assumed? Is NATO, is the security guarantees that we've all been asking for, are any of them in the end worth the paper they are written on. It is precisely because of the gathering panic that American security guarantees are indeed worthless that you see people like MBS pleading with the Americans to continue the war and to fight it to a conclusion, regardless of the cost. Regardless of the cost to the United States and to Saudi Arabia, which is the country that MBS notionally leads. Because if American security guarantees are worthless, where does that leave Saudi Arabia? A big country, a substantial population, but a country without an independent industrial and technology base, confronted by an apparently all-conquering Iran. And this, for MBS and for some of the other Gulf rulers, must be a growing nightmare. Well, I don't think at this particular point in time, anybody in Washington is talking about agreeing a grand bargain with Vladimir Putin. But it is not impossible that discussions between the Americans and the Russians will begin soon. Discussions not about Ukraine, but about restoring some kind of stability in global energy markets, something that Putin talked about to the Americans, talked about to Trump in their first ever telephone call more than a year ago, first ever telephone call over the course of Trump's second term, I should make clear, and that the Russians might act to facilitate negotiations between the Americans and the Iranians. But of course, as I said, that this will inevitably come with a price in Ukraine, obviously, but ultimately a price relating to that other long-term, never-changing Russian objective, which is to renegotiate or to negotiate a fundamental change to the security architecture of Europe, something which inevitably would amount to a significant dilution of NATO, something which, as the Russians have always insisted, should return the NATO situation, should return the security situation in Europe to something that more closely approximated to what the Russians imagined that they had agreed with the Americans at the end of the Cold War, a situation where the Americans, NATO, would not expand beyond the border of United Germany, that there would not be 1 inch of expansion east. And as I said, that is for the Europeans a strategic nightmare, just as NBS must now face the horrifying possibility of being left by the Americans confronting an all-conquering Iran, so the Europeans must fear that they could be left confronting an immensely empowered Russia in Europe without the certainty of American protection. So anyway, that's where I think we are at the present time. Now, I think I have described the situation in the Middle East. I remain of the view that there is a strong possibility, despite all the military risks, that the president and some of his officials will go for broke, that they will disregard any advice to the contrary, and that they will indeed order the attack on Kharg Island or the other island on the Strait of Hormuz, or perhaps both at the same time. There's even some talk that they would try to capture one of the ports, the Iranian ports, on the Iranian coastline, something which I think would be even more difficult to hold on to. And by the way, and for the record, the Iranians seem to have successfully, or at least they seem to have engaged an American aircraft close to this particular port. And though they didn't actually shoot it down, the fact that they were able to engage this aircraft close to that port shows again that the Iranians still have functioning air defense capabilities along their coastline. So anyway, I think that there still remains a strong chance that we will see an American attack of that kind over the next few days. But for what it is worth, which by the way is very little, but for what it is worth, I think that even the president is now starting to sense that the situation is slipping out of his control, that he cannot dictate the military outcome anymore, and that this explains why there is all this urgency and renewed effort to get negotiations going. To repeat again, if the negotiations ever do take place in Islamabad or wherever, the Iranians will approach them from a far stronger position than the one they were in before this conflict began. They will demand concessions, which the Americans will find extremely difficult to make. And I think it all but inconceivable that the Iranians will agree to a ceasefire whilst the negotiations are underway. It will be like the Paris talks between the Americans and the North Vietnamese all over again, just as in a kind of a way the unsuccessful talks between the Americans, the Russians and the Ukrainians, which we have seen over the last few weeks, since January in fact, were talks of that kind also. Talks which took place, but with no ceasefire in effect. Well, I am not going to spend time debating the diplomacy over the conflict in Ukraine, because for the moment there isn't one. The Russians have lost, as far as I can tell, all interest in them. There was, within the last couple of days, I think it was actually the day before yesterday, a meeting in Moscow between Vladimir Putin and the Union of Industrialists in Russia. This is a very interesting meeting in some respects. I don't agree with those who say that Putin's comments over the course of this meeting were banal and simply repeated old talking points. I think he did actually say some quite interesting things. He spoke about the potentially catastrophic effect on the global economy of the conflict in the Middle East. He compared its effect with the effect of the pandemic, the recent effect of the pandemic. He made it, again, crystal clear that as far as he's concerned, and as far as the Russians are concerned, it is the United States that has acted in a way that has brought this disaster upon itself and potentially the world. And he had some very, very interesting things to say about Russia's position in terms of the enormous increase in energy prices. He said that yes, Russia is indeed going to benefit in financial terms from this rise in oil prices. He said that it would be a major mistake, however, to spend all the money on some great spending spree. The right thing to do with it was be to pay off debt, to improve the overall financial position of the government and of Russian companies, to take a conservative approach to fiscal and debt policy. And, well, he also reminded everybody in the audience that just as oil prices can go up, they are equally capable of coming back down again. It was typical Putin, a message of prudence, and it was also, by the way, very well received by the audience. And Putin also said, and again, I think the importance of these words can be underestimated. He said that in the current global crisis, and he did speak of it as a global crisis, it remains particularly important for Russia to remain united and strong. He clearly envisages more chaos and conflict in the future. And on the one hand, he is positioning Russia to take advantage of it. But on the other hand, like all Russian leaders, he is concerned about long-term stability. And this, of course, dovetails exactly with what his foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, said a few days ago about how the current situation feels like the start of World War III. Anyway, that was what Putin said about the global situation. But apparently, off the record, and when Putin meets with the industrialists, we have the big formal speech, but often it's what he says to them off the record that is even more important. 2 years ago, for example, he warned them that whatever happens, whatever apparent improvement there is in relations between the United States and Russia, the reality of sanctions is that they will stay. No Russian businessman should ever make the mistake of thinking that the United States or the West is ever serious or acting in good faith when it talks about lifting sanctions. And no Russian businessman or business group should ever make future business calculations on the assumption that sanctions may one day be lifted. It's a very interesting speech, or rather address. All of that was said in private. It was never published on the Kremlin's website, but these comments were all over the Russian media. And it's been the same this time. Putin talked about the situation in the war in Ukraine, the one that the Russians are currently fighting. And he told the industrialists that the war is going to go on, that nobody should expect a diplomatic settlement, that the Ukrainians are clearly not interested in one, and that the immediate priority is to capture Donbass. And, well, there's an article today in the Financial Times which says that he then solicited donations from some of the Russian businessmen present to help with the funding of the war, and some of them came forward and offered funding. I am sure that Dmitry Peskov has got this right. The businessmen, the industrialists, I should say, whatever they might once have been, are now mostly deeply patriotic and strongly supportive of the war. Anyway, one of them apparently came forward, told Putin that he'd made his fortune in the corrupt privatizations of the 1990s, that he felt that this was the moment that he needed to pay back some of his money to the country after all that had happened, and he offered to make a big donation to the Russian war budget, which was accepted, and supposedly two other businessmen who made their fortunes in the same era, the 1990s, came forward and did the same. To me, I have to say, this whole thing looks very much like these people, always uncomfortable about the legitimacy of their wealth, once again using a particular situation in order to buy themselves goodwill, call it, if you like, a payment for a type of insurance. That's what it looks like to me. But anyway, the point was, Putin at this meeting focused entirely on the war, expecting only a military resolution to it. Now, there has in fact been quite a lot of information about the state of the war from various sources. Sergei Poletayev, Russian military commentator, has written another overview of the state of the war. He says, and I have absolutely no doubt that he's right, by the way, that that as the Russians have been reorganizing, the Ukrainians have tried to exploit this by launching counterattacks, specifically in the Zaporozhye region, but the counterattacks there have been unsuccessful. And Poletayev makes exactly the same point that I've made, that the Ukrainians have never provided convincing evidence that they control any of the places that they claim to have recaptured, and we find every so often evidence that the Russians indeed retain presences in all of these places, including, by the way, over the last few hours, the important village of Ternovata. For the record, the Russians continue to advance westwards towards Orekhov. I find that impossible to reconcile with any serious Ukrainian counteroffensive on their northern flank. The fact that the Russians continue to advance, that they are now in the process of encircling a place called Gulyapolske, to my mind, calls into question the entire narrative about this supposed offensive that is taking place in northern Zaporozhye region. But there's been a lot of further information about other places. Radovka has said that Belitskaya, the town to the north of Rodinska, which is itself north of Pakrovsk, that Belitskaya is now surrounded. There's only one important position left to capture, though it is a difficult one to capture, which is another slag heap located to the southwest of Belitska, but the Russians appear to be confident of capturing that. And perhaps there was an even more interesting overall discussion of the state of the war by the writer who goes by the name of Events in Ukraine in his indispensable Substack blog. I noticed that this writer, who I presume is a Russian-speaking Ukrainian of a relatively young but very sympathetic to the Soviet Union, and with what one might perhaps say sort of pro-communist convictions. His hero is the Soviet politician Alexander Shelepin, about whom one day, no doubt, I will say a great deal more. Anyway, to skip that. Anyway, he's done a very interesting overview of the state of the war in Donbass, and he bases it on Ukrainian accounts, which are very interesting because, of course, they continue to make assertions such as that the Ukrainians still control part of Chasov Yar and part of a small town called Yampol. I am confident that both of these places are actually controlled by the Russians. But the overall message, nonetheless, was that the Ukrainian defenses in Donbass, in Donetsk region, are disintegrating, that there is critical shortages of men and supplies, that the Russians have drone dominance. I believe that the Russians this year are going to demonstrate mastery over Ukrainian drones, just saying, and that the Russians are close to capturing Konstantinovka. He publishes various reports from Ukrainian bloggers about the disastrous situation of the Ukrainian forces in Konstantinovka, which to my mind corroborate Russian claims that they have not only broken into Konstantinovka, but have divided the garrison, split the garrison into two parts. And he makes the further point that towns like Slavyansk, Kramatorsk are now well within drone and artillery range, that the first evacuations from these towns are taking place. He expects them to be invested, to be surrounded by the Russians, at least that's my take of it, and for the Russians to infiltrate and capture them before long, probably at some point this summer. And I agree. Anyway, Putin is resolved to achieve that. I think he's equally resolved to achieve the objectives, the territorial objectives of the special military operation by military means. Once he's done that, once the Russians have done that, once they've taken Donbass and Zaporozhye region, once they reach the Dnieper, and perhaps crossed over into Kherson region too, it'll be interesting to see what happens next. Whether at that point, if the Ukrainians remain as defiant as ever, the Russians might decide that advances towards Kharkiv, Odessa, and Kiev, further such advances, are necessary. In my opinion, the unequivocal answer is yes. About Odessa, I don't personally have any doubt, but as to that, we will have to wait and see. Anyway, this is where I'm going to finish today's program. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, X and Substack. Please remember to support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. That's me for today. Let me remind you again to tick the like button and check your subscription to this channel if you've liked this video, and all that remains is for me to wish you a good day.